are watching RT America. Question more.
As more and more time passes between the financial crisis of 2008 and the present day, many Americans forget how inextricably these catastrophic events were linked to and caused by an unparalleled culture of negligence and abuse spanning our financial and real estate industries. With 10 years of an excruciatingly long recovery now in the rearview mirror, it's easy to just dismiss the whole generation-shaping experience as a simple accident or the malfeasance of a few evil Wall Street geniuses, but that would be missing the point, according to author and former real estate entrepreneur Charlie Robinson. And he argues his case in his recently released book, The Octopus of Global Control. Sean Stone sat down with Robinson earlier to hear more about his firsthand perspective on the crisis and its aftermath.
Charlie, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start by talking about how you got into writing this book about the octopus of global control, which is very ambitious in its scope. And, you know, coming from a guy who was involved in subprime mortgage lending, what drove you into this world of conspiracy and understanding the big picture of politics and economics?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say that on the morning of September 11th, I had it all figured out, but that wasn't the case. I wound up living in Las Vegas, doing new home sales and working during the boom and the bust. And on the way up, it was insanity. And everybody could get a loan, and there were sales everywhere. People were camping out in our parking lot so that they could be the first person to the lottery to get to buy a house. Very unsustainable, very alarming. It was great at the time, but as the market took off a little bit, there was a point at which it stalled out. And I was working for one of the big home builders in town, and like a lot of home builders, they came up with the idea that they would, in order to sort of stimulate the sales as it stalled out, they would offer incentives. So the way it would work is we would have, say, a $500,000 house for sale. We'd have $100,000 of incentive money, sort of like a bucket of money you could play around with. You could use that to buy down your interest rate, and you could use it for closing costs, and those are no problems. But you could take it straight off the price of the house. So a $500,000 house now costs you $400,000. The problem is, as the market stalled, loan programs started going away and people couldn't get qualified. So I was in a sales meeting, and our manager said that what we were going to do is we were going to allow people to use that incentive money, that $100,000, and we could pay down, say the husband and the wife both have car payments and they both have credit cards. We would use that money to wipe that out, then run their debt to equity ratios, and they would magically qualify. Well, that's fraud. I mean, that's flat out mortgage fraud. So anyone in that meeting knew that I was going to probably raise my hand. And I said to my boss, have we cleared this with our legal department? And I will never forget his words. He said, I'd rather beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. So I was obviously alarmed at that. I think a lot of us were, because we have real estate license at stake. And that was a signal to me that things had gotten completely out of control. Of course, I was later fired, not for that officially, but we all knew what it was about. And so you have people getting foreclosed on their homes because they were just getting roped into this, this whole frenzy. And it was fueled by the media a great deal. I mean, I think Las Vegas was the hottest real estate market in the world, maybe tied with Dubai, but it was nuts. And these home builders had a huge stake, and they were buying land like crazy, and they couldn't afford for the sales to stop. So they came up with some inventive, creative ways to do it. And they were, some of them were actually illegal. So that woke me up to the criminal fraud. And then at about the same time that was happening, I read John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and that changed my life. I mean, it filled in all the gaps as to how the IMF and the World Bank collude together to enslave third world countries, get them to agree to have a hydroelectric power plant built in their country with the understanding that it'll generate electricity, it'll create jobs, your children will be able to learn to read at night because there'll be electricity. All these things were a total scam. It was never going to pencil out, and they knew that. So that money flowed from the IMF and the World Bank, not to the country, but to the engineering firms like Halliburton, Bechtel, in John Perkins' book. The company was called Maine, but they're gone. And so these indigenous people in these third world countries would be left holding the bag on a huge debt that could never be repaid because it was never meant to be repaid. It was always a scam. So when they couldn't make their payments, the IMF and World Bank would say, you owe us a lot of money, but I think we can work something out. You need to vote with us on the next UN resolution, or maybe you have to privatize your lumber industry and sell it to my buddy, or allow us to build a military base. So once I read that, the pieces sort of all came together, and I realized these institutions that are out there, United Nations, IMF, World Bank, Council on Foreign Relations, that are talking about how they're helping humanity, they're the problem. They're the worst, and they're the reason why we have these gigantic problems. So it woke me up to that. It was a gradual thing starting with 9/11, and it sort of built based on my experiences. And over the years, I just sort of was kind of writing the book in my head.
So speaking of Perkins' book, because he understood exactly what we were saying about how essentially the IMF, the World Bank, the overall Federal Reserve banking system, let's call it, of debt-based economics, was being imposed on third world countries all through the Cold War. And then it struck me when this whole Great Recession started in 2008, 9 time period, that we were looking at the same policies that had been implemented against third world countries being brought home to roost. And essentially what you saw were people who basically had, they'd been they'd been out with these mortgages that they weren't sustainable. They had basically over leveraged. They had way too much debt, and all of a sudden it collapsed. They lost their homes. Many people ended up losing not only wealth but also putting themselves into much more debt slavery, as we saw with everything from education, schooling, right? What are they called? School loans, right? To healthcare, you name it. All this just piling on the American people. So, to your analysis, was this Great Recession very much that same Perkins policy that had been used abroad being brought home to the American people?
I think so. It wasn't, you would like to think that your government wouldn't do that to you, but I think that's a bit naive. I remember on a personal level, when I was buying my first house out there in Las Vegas, I said I wanted to do a 30-year fixed loan, and the guy that was doing my mortgage for me was actually a guy I worked with, and he said, I just do a 5-year adjustable. And I said, no, I don't really want that. I want a 30-year fixed. He goes, no, do a 5-year adjustable. And I said, listen, I'm telling you, I want a 30-year fixed. I'm telling you what I want. I wound up doing that. And then I found out later the reason why I was getting pushed for the 5-year adjustable mortgage was because his commission was triple for that. So there was a financial incentive to screw people. Now, they could justify it. I don't mean to say that guy was a bad guy, but he could justify this by saying, look, you're never going to stay in your house more than 5 years anyway. So these programs, like you said, that John Perkins talks about that were used to enslave foreign countries, it's a great formula for control. Works like a charm. That's why they keep doing it, and they'll continue to do that. So you watch as they go and blow up a country, and then who gets the business to go in and rebuild it? Halliburton or KBR. These gigantic companies that have a financial stake in war. And now, as we see what's going on lately with Syria, we're walking right into something again, the exact same thing. We never seem to learn from these mistakes, and the media is awfully quiet about the past. They don't tend to bring that up. They tell us, "Oh, this time it's different." Yeah, right.
All right. Well, you have now become a student of history. Tell us about your book a little bit. What is the octopus that controls the globe?
Yeah. The Octopus of Global Control is the book. Talks about the 8 tentacles that are used to control society, part of it military, banking, scientific, spiritual, media. And it becomes very obvious when you look back. I felt like I learned history going through school, and then I had to unlearn everything that I thought I knew and learn the new version of history, because it's quite different from what we were taught in school. You talk about there's a great quote in the book. I quoted 500 different people that were either experts or had some sort of involvement in the most important events of our history. And you read a quote from a guy named Francis Highland, who was the mayor of New York City. And you get about 3/4 of the way through and you think, oh, this is a guy that's talking about today. He's talking about the problems that we're facing today. But that quote was from 1922. It's identical to the same problems we're having now. So, these events that are happening, they're not accidental. It's not a haphazard. There's a very, very big plan that has been set forth well over 100 years, and they're running it to this day. And I'd say probably the most dangerous of the 8 tentacles is one that you might not think, and that's the banking. So you get the banking. People don't understand about the Federal Reserve not being an actual government agency. I was taught it was a quasi-government agency, whatever that means. It's not that either. It's a privately owned bank that prints our money and then loans it to us at interest. And it is not an exaggeration to say that it's a scheme. It's a trap. You cannot pay back all the money. It's like a rigged carnival game. And you'll never hear that on the news, of course, because they don't want you to know that. And it's probably one of the reasons why we're not educated in school about banking and money. And you graduate from high school and you go, I don't know anything about money. Well, it's intentional. They don't want you to know, because the more you know, the more you would realize how totally crooked and rigged the game is. So.
Before we can colonize Mars, we'll have to practice.